Good evening, everybody. I'm really glad to welcome you to this unique virtual conversation we're calling A Nation in Crisis with two extraordinary leaders, Governor Tom Kean and Reverend Bill Howard. Before we continue, I do want to let you all know about another NJPAC event coming up soon. It's called Pioneers of Protest, celebrating 100 years of women's voting. This is an event that is the brainchild of Municipal Council President Mildred Crump, and it's organized by women at NJPAC, and will be held next Monday, a week from tonight, at this time, 7 p.m., August 17th at 7 p.m., a century, almost to the day, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We'll be joined at that event by some of New Jersey's most inspiring women in politics, Governor Christine Todd Whitman, current New Jersey Secretary of State Tahisha Way, Congresswomen Mikey Sherrill and Bonnie Watson-Coleman, and President Crump. Mayor Baraka will also be joining us. I hope you'll be there for this fantastic centennial celebration that examines how women achieve the vote and how the strategies they developed to do so are still in use today. Let me just say a word about our guest tonight. If you are anything like me, you are always looking for individuals who are wiser than you, who have greater experience, and who have the insight to identify the right thing to do in an increasingly puzzling and complex world, and of course the moral strength to actually do it. So whether they are teachers, influencers, elders, or mentors today, I think we all need these guides who have an instinct for how to do the right thing. Both Governor Kean, who was the original visionary of NJPAC, and Reverend Howard have been those essential mentors to me, certainly for the time that I've been in Newark, and the opportunity to hear them now discussing the critical issues of the day is something I've been looking forward to for weeks. I'm so glad they've been able to make the time to be here with us. And I'm so pleased that our NJPAC board member and the CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Ryan Haygood, has agreed to moderate the conversation. I'm also grateful to the PSEG Foundation for making this event possible, and for the Art Center's longtime friend, Rick Thigpen, the chair of the PSEG Foundation and Senior Vice President of Corporate Citizenship at PSEG, for introducing our panelists tonight. And talking a little bit about PSEG's work in social justice. Rick, all yours. Please take over.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it. And it's really a privilege to be here tonight on behalf of the family at Public Service. You know, we've always committed ourselves to trying to make New Jersey a better place. And now we've launched a Powering Equity and Social Justice initiative in line with all that's been going on in our great country in 2020. And we think that this is an outstanding addition to the many things that we do. And certainly helping to foster critical conversations on race and social justice is one of those things. And also being a sponsor of the True Diversity film series along with NJPAC. And another film is coming up. You've seen it on your screen recently. So it's really a privilege to be here tonight. Everybody should recognize that 2020 is quite an extraordinary year, whether it's about renaming the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs, or taking the name of Aunt Jemima off a product, or even changing the name of the Washington Redskins. America is beginning to go through some transitions. Some of us think it's much overdue, and some of us think it needs to be done. So having said that, we have an outstanding panel tonight, and I would just say something very brief about both of them. First off, Reverend Bill Howard, who is a lifelong mentor of mine, someone who's taught me so much, and who's lived and experienced so much of the transition of America into a greater democracy. He has so much to offer us. And Governor Tom Kean, a gentleman whom I also admire, who's had the unique distinction of being the most popular politician in the great state of New Jersey for more than a generation. But it's really my honor to turn this program over to an outstanding moderator, a nationally respected civil rights attorney, and the CEO, as well as the grand poobah of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. He's a friend of mine and someone who I have a lot of respect for, who knows this world of social justice better than all of us. I turn it over to Ryan Haygood.
Hey, Rick Thigpen, thanks for that gracious introduction. Thank you, John Schreiber, to you and Chelsea and your team for hosting tonight's conversation. I received from you the upgrade to the Grand Poobah. Really humbled to be here tonight to participate in this conversation, and thank you all for joining us for what John is styling A Nation in Crisis, a conversation with two iconic leaders on our present reality and the forces that shaped it. As Rick mentioned, my name is Ryan Haygood. I lead the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We were founded 21 years ago by Alan Lowenstein and his wife, Amy. And our mission really is to identify what we think of as structural load-bearing walls of racial inequality that, when toppled, open up opportunities for people of color in the areas of economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice. We are governed by a mighty board of trustees, empowered by a majority women of color team of some of the fiercest advocates I know, who are working transformatively to advance racial justice here in New Jersey, but in a way that can serve as a national model. I'm honored to moderate this panel at such a critical moment in time. And I've been thinking a lot about this moment in time as one that is once painful and precious. The moment is first painful because we stand, I think, at the convergence of multiple pandemics. We confront in this moment a public health crisis from a virus that has ravaged communities, disproportionately Black and Latina communities. Indeed, I think by the end of this pandemic, we will each have experienced very personally the results of the coronavirus. Some of us even have lost folks to this terrible disease. We are also confronted in this moment by a pandemic of law enforcement's killing of unarmed Black people across this country. We confront in this moment a crisis of education, where hundreds of thousands of kids in New Jersey's segregated school systems are learning to learn online at home at this very hour without access to online learning. We confront in this moment one of the greatest economic challenges since the Great Depression, with more than 1 million people here in New Jersey filing recently for unemployment benefits. And at this moment, ahead of one of the most important elections in recent history, we confront an attack on our democracy that is historic, both in terms of its scope and in terms of its intensity. These pandemics have led us as a country to finally reckon with the painful reality that we are a United States divided by race, built upon a foundation cracked by structural racism and designed to advance anti-Blackness. And these cracks are causing earthquakes in Black, brown, and other communities of color across this land. But while this moment is painful, we know that this potentially transformative moment is precious too. It's precious because millions of people across this country in thousands of cities, including right here in New Jersey, have joined in protests led by young people at what is being recognized as the third Reconstruction, to put Reverend Barber's term forward, that are dedicated, as the late Congressman John Lewis said, to getting into good trouble to help redeem the soul of this nation. And part of that good trouble, that redemption, requires us to help build a new foundation, a new system, to create a new normal in which Black lives really matter. Tonight, we're fortunate to be joined by two iconic leaders who have dedicated their careers, their lives to getting into this kind of good trouble. Governor Kean served as the 40th governor of New Jersey, and Pastor Howard led the storied Bethany Baptist Church, Newark's oldest Black Baptist church, to talk about this moment, how we got here, and what we are to do collectively, together, to move forward to redeem our nation's soul. Governor Kean and Pastor Howard are wise, thoughtful people who have committed themselves to doing what is right and what is fair for New Jerseyans and people across the globe. Governor Kean spent his time as governor leading groundbreaking work to advance bipartisanship, civil liberties, and education, and he continued on this work after leaving Trenton through his leadership of both Drew University and the 9/11 Commission. Reverend Howard's time at New York Theological Seminary, the National Council of Churches, and Newark's Bethany Baptist Church gave him a global perspective on justice that led him to fight racism not only at home here in New Jersey and in America, but in countries across the globe, particularly in apartheid South Africa. We have an hour for this conversation, followed by 25 minutes or so for Q&A, and I promise to get to as many of your questions as we can in the time we have. Please list your questions in the chat in the Q&A below. So in preparing for tonight's conversation, I was struck by the reality that both Governor Kean and Pastor Howard grew up in apartheid America. Governor Kean in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and Pastor Howard in America's Georgia. And their paths first crossed during the international effort to divest from apartheid South Africa in 1985. At that time, Pastor Howard, who then served as the chair of the American Committee on Africa, and Larry Ham, who was representing the People's Organization of Progress, which he leads today, hosted an all-night vigil outside of the New Jersey State House to urge Governor Kean to sign legislation withdrawing billions of dollars in pension funds for more than 100 companies in New Jersey doing business in apartheid South Africa. And so I'd like to begin with you, Pastor Howard, and I'd like for you to talk to us about that moment in 1985. Why did you, a Black man from America's Georgia, join the fight to end apartheid in South Africa? And what specifically did you seek to accomplish? And do you see any parallels in your advocacy then to what we're seeing across the nation today? Welcome, Pastor Howard.
Thank you, Ryan. As a poor boy from Georgia, I'm not sure I can remember that long question, but let me see. First of all, the name Albert Lutuli may be familiar to you. He was the first Black South African or African to win the Nobel Prize. He was president of the African National Congress. And in the, I think, 1962 or so, when we were in the belly of the beast, so to speak, in South Georgia, Dr. King, who was clearly the out front leader in that time, signed a joint statement with this man, Albert Lutuli, whom we had never heard of, condemning apartheid in South Africa. So those two worlds in 62 were joined. And I made the first speech against apartheid in 1962 when I was in the 11th grade in the segregated Sumter High School in Americus, Georgia. So from that time forward, I was fairly engaged in the anti-apartheid struggle, persona non grata in South Africa from about 1975 until Mr. Mandela was released from prison. So it was not a stretch for me to be involved. And whatever I did in those days was actually connectable to Jim Crow in Southwest Georgia. And of course, Governor Kean and I met that fateful morning. I guess it must have been in 1986. Governor, help me out here. Larry, who had been, of course, my friend for a very long time when he was a student at Princeton University, Governor Kean's alma mater. From, I guess, around 75, Larry and I became friends. And we determined, since I lived in New Jersey, although operating in different parts of the country and around the world, we were both residents of New Jersey. We were very concerned that both houses of the legislature had voted in favor of this divestment. The governor had not yet signed the bill. And I had been involved with Assemblyman Willie Brown as he presented this bill on the assembly floor. So Larry and I decided, what could we do to encourage the governor? And we decided we would sleep on the steps of the Capitol. Now, I must say the state police during the night had some fun with us because the Black community in Trenton heard we were there. We didn't publicize it, but they heard we were there, and they brought us soul food, and they brought us music, and sometimes it disturbed the neighbors and they called the cops. But on that morning, when people began to come in to work through the front door of the Capitol building, we attracted a little attention. And eventually, I believe a member of the state police, or maybe someone from the governor's staff, came out front and said, "The governor would like to see you." And we didn't know exactly what that meant, but we went inside and we were received quite graciously by the governor. And we talked back and forth about this bill and about divestment, about South Africa. And later that day, the governor made a decision to sign the bill. Now, I want to be careful not to make a connection between our demonstration, so to speak, and the governor's decision, but he did on that very day in the afternoon announce he would sign the bill. I think I'm racing forward trying to make this short, but that's essentially it. And let me just say, later on, the governor signed the bill, and he was gracious enough to invite me to be a part of the ceremony where he signed the bill into law.
Mm-hmm. And Governor Kean, thank you, Pastor. Governor Kean, what were your recollections from that period? How did you come to know that Pastor Howard and Larry Ham were sleeping on the State House lawn? And can you talk about sort of what you remember from that period and the kind of opposition you faced in signing the legislation? Folks that encourage you, not the business community, other entities.
Well, first of all, I heard about it because it's not that usual for people to sleep on the State House lawn or on the steps. So when somebody does it, you have to hear about it, especially if they're two people of great distinction, as these were. This was a difficult decision because there were other alternatives. It wasn't a question of signing it or not signing it. I could have conditionally vetoed it, a number of things with it. But shortly before I had to make the decision, the leader of South Africa stood up and said, "It's going to be apartheid forever." Now, a lot of people in this country had said, it's phasing out, it's going to disappear. He says apartheid forever. I heard that in the car radio driving at Trenton, and I said, I'm going to sign that bill. Now, the business community didn't like it. They had other ways of doing it. Great corporations were trying to work with South Africa to help their businesses in South Africa to segregate. And they said, we can do it that way. The administration in Washington, the Reagan administration, thought I'd be interfering in foreign policy if I signed the bill. So there was opposition, but it was the right thing to do. And when you hear from somebody like Reverend Howard, who puts it only in moral terms, and you realize there's really no choice. And I realized that day I really had no choice.
And in signing the bill, you made New Jersey the first state in the country to divest from South Africa?
Yeah, it was the first, and fortunately, there weren't that many more who followed. A few, but not enough. But the nice thing was I heard in a wonderful letter from South Africa that was the first time the apartheid government of South Africa realized their actions might have economic consequences for the country. And that made them slow down and think again. And if that happened, I'm very grateful.
Mm-hmm. And so, Governor Kean, I'm glad you lifted this point up, because when we were preparing for this conversation, you talked about how you were a unique governor in the sense that you were seen as sort of the consummate statesman. You were someone who marched with Dr. King. You were someone for whom his wife came to New Jersey and campaigned in your second re-election. Can you talk about sort of how you approach the role as governor, what you think of when you think of statesmanship, and sort of how you held that responsibility at such a critical time while you led this state? Well,
look, it's first of all, when Coretta King came in for me, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. She came in for me as a Republican, but she didn't even come in for Democrats very often. So when she came in to campaign for somebody, it made a real statement. And I just couldn't have been prouder of that moment when she did. And in my whole life, I went down to Washington when I was 3 years old when my father was elected to Congress. And I was put in, and people don't remember what kind of a city it was. Black people and white people couldn't go to the movies together. When my father had black constituents to town, he couldn't take them to a restaurant because the restaurants were segregated. Everything was segregated. It was a southern town, but it was the nation's capital. They didn't desegregate the restaurants. So Dwight Eisenhower actually made phone calls to restaurant owners saying, this is wrong. Can you change it? So I grew up in that kind of environment, recognizing the fact, because I made very good friends later in the African American community, realizing what was going on, realizing the depth of the horror that segregation really was, recognizing the fact that the promises made after the Civil War had not been put into fruition 100 years later. I became, I guess today, what you call a militant on that particular subject, because I thought you simply have to take steps forward. And I'd say the same thing today.
One of the things that strikes me about this conversation is that you meet in the mid-1980s, you, Governor Kean, having grown up in segregated Washington, D.C., you, Pastor Howard, having grown up in segregated Americas, Georgia. Your paths intersect around an effort to end apartheid in South Africa. And 35 years later tonight, we live in a New Jersey, to your point, Governor Kean, in our preparation for this conversation, a New Jersey that is the second most racially diverse state next to California, but the 6th or 7th most segregated state in the country. So we live in a space, a state that has this rich diversity alongside this really strict racial discrimination. We live in a state that's with some incredible prosperity and some punishing poverty. Pastor Howard, could you talk a bit about sort of with that reality in mind, what are some of the lessons learned from your work, your advocacy to end racial apartheid in South Africa, even as we recognize the way that race still divides and plays a significant role here in New Jersey today?
Well, I think we are often tempted to make too much of a comparison between the United States and South Africa. South Africa has had for quite a long time a kind of racial discrimination paradigm operating, but apartheid did not actually come to South Africa until 1948, when the Afrikaners took over the government. Before that, the British were in charge. And, South Africa, of course, is overwhelmingly Black. And the heritage of slavery, although you did have harsh discrimination in South Africa, you didn't have that heritage of slavery. So the United States, Jim Crow segregation is a byproduct of slavery. And we have to understand the graduations that we have had from slavery, never divorce, but graduation. So we are in slavery, and then we have emancipation, and then we have sharecropping, and we have Jim Crow, and then we have de facto, and then we keep missing opportunities to reset and to rethink the horrific origin of the country in slavery. We make just enough of an adaptation, for example, to protest and resistance, to appease the opponents of racial discrimination, but never to take the bull by the horns. So when you talk about Reverend Barber's third Reconstruction, we had the opportunity, and we actually moved in a certain direction with Oliver Howard chairing the Freedmen's Bureau. And then you had, at the death of Lincoln, the complete retrenchment of Reconstruction and turning backward, the founding of the Klan, for example, the Night Riders and so forth. And then we had something called the Civil Rights Movement. I cut my teeth on that movement. I came to adulthood. I went to the haven of Black protests, Morehouse College. In fact, I would have to tell you that, to let you know how ill-informed I was a solid B+ student, but I only applied to Morehouse because I thought they were waiting for me to arrive.
Mm.
In any case, in that movement, we came again to the threshold of promise, a threshold of a new day for the country. Shall we call it a reset? We recognize so many fundamental things at the culmination of that period in the late 60s. For example, we pronounced that racism was not a matter of individual sentiment, but it was an institutionalized phenomenon. And we still have that phenomenon today, even though we have tinkered with the thing around the edges. For example, last year we celebrated, what was it, the 50th anniversary of formal African-American studies in the great universities of our country. That was a remarkable thing that came out of this period about which I speak. But still today, the great universities of our country are the gatekeepers of the doctrine of white supremacy. So, I mean, I don't know if your question was long, my answer was perhaps too long.
No,
So I started, and look, remember in 1967, Governor Kean, at the Riverside Church in New York, Dr. Kean gave what became known as his anti-Vietnam War speech.
Yeah.
But that speech is far more significant in terms of his judgment about our country. He said that there had been progressive laws passed, various cosmetic things have changed, and make no mistake, there have been changes. But he said, despite commission reports like Kerner Commission and so on, he said he had come to the understanding, and this is April 4th, 1967, that if America did everything it was set up to do properly, it would still generate what he called the giant triplets: racism, poverty, and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, unless we had a revolution of values, this would be our future. And if you read the really excellent book recently released by Professor Eddie Glaude from Princeton called Begin Again, where he talks about the writings of Baldwin, he really helps us to see in the most literate way you can imagine that we are on the threshold now of that new opportunity, post-first Reconstruction, post-second Reconstruction. We're positioned now to decide, will we be a truly great nation, or will we recoil and do things the way we always have? Many young adults have consulted with me in this period. Dr. Howard, how are things different from the way they were when you were growing up? And I said, well, the power structure of the country is now either consciously or unconsciously looking for that sweet spot that will take people off the streets again. And once those people leave the streets, because of the institutional nature of our predicament, we fall back into our comfort zone.
So Pastor Howard, I love this idea, your point about the threshold of promise, that we don't advance it and take the bull by the horns. I know you're really passionate about economic justice. And so I just want to ask you, my colleagues, Andrea McChristian and Laura Sullivan, wrote this report about the racial wealth gap in New Jersey, and they find that in New Jersey, the median net wealth for white families is $352,000. Highest net wealth of any family in the country, $352,000. But by stark, really staggering, really shameful contrast, the median net wealth for black families is $6,100. So situating your sort of your threshold of promise idea in that racial disparity around economic justice, what does it mean in the context of economic justice in New Jersey, right? One of the wealthiest states in the country with some of the most punishing poverty. What does that mean to do more than approach the threshold of promise, to realize the promise in that area?
Without the reset, the short answer is simply this. America would tell you that there are black people in New Jersey who are among the rich people of our state. Do you understand? This is the way the argument is often shut down. And the dilemma, we have racism, incidentally, is at the core of what ails us. And it's a sickness, it's a moral failing. It's built on a lie. But we also have unbridled capitalism. Now, to a good Republican, that's a bad thing to say, but let me just say this. I've been to so-called communist countries. I mean, you name them, I've been to them as a visitor. China, back in the old Soviet Union, I've been to Cuba, you name them, I've been to these places, right? I don't have a brief for societies without a robust market system. At the same time, I am an opponent of centralized power, whether it's on the right or the left. And what we have here is talented people enabled by privilege will always win in a laissez-faire capitalist model. And what we're left with is a sea of people of all colors, by the way, languishing either in poverty or on the edge of poverty. And race, incidentally, is the factor that keeps them from uniting to plead their case together. I think Reverend Barber would agree with me if he were on this line. In Americus, Georgia, the most intriguing thing for me as a young boy was to be discriminated against as an African American, called the N-word by the poorest white people you've ever seen, with running noses, no warm coats in the winter, but they found some comfort in being, as they say, white. And this is a dilemma that America hides from us with the cooperation of white poor people.
That's right. So Governor Kean, you spoke a lot in the preparation for this conversation about your passion for education. You talked about, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, about how although New Jersey is one of the most racially diverse states in the country, it also has some of the most punishing racial segregation, and it shows up in our classrooms. My wife is just to the right of me, about 5 yards, and she's been teaching, for example, in Newark for more than 20 years. She's taught in 3 different schools, thousands of kids. She's been the principal of a district school here in Newark, Avon Avenue School, for the last 10 years. And yet, Governor Kean, to your point earlier, in that time, she's never had a white student in her classroom, ever.
Wow.
And she would say to you, she's not alone. A number of her colleagues here in Newark and in other cities across New Jersey, they've not had white kids either. In fact, white kids, black kids, typically, they just don't share classrooms. And so I'd love for you to just say a word about your views on this issue, and particularly in light of the moment where we've got, millions of people sort of move to protest things like racial segregation, and whether you think there's a real promise in New Jersey to finally confront that issue.
The promise is there, but it's still far away. And I believe so strongly in education and desegregated education because of my own background. I think intellectually, I was always in favor of desegregation, of equality, all those things intellectually. I read books. I like what was in the books. I knew my father done some things that I approved of in that area. In college, I debated in that regard. But in high school, I was lucky enough to take a couple of jobs that brought me into close context with people who were not of my color, people who I would not have seen otherwise, and not gotten to know otherwise, certainly. And because of those experiences, I not only had contact, but I made some close friends. So by the time I was getting ready for college, I already had 2 or 3 very close friends in the Black community. And I'll tell you this, if you have close friends, you understand better the problems than you do from reading any books or any speeches or anything else. And to me, segregated schools deny people the opportunity to get to know each other as people, no matter what color they are, no matter what background they are. And if you can create that, if you can have experiences where people get to know each other, like each other, support each other, marry each other, whatever, a lot of these problems we're talking about are going to go away a lot faster. And I think it's remarkable, and Reverend Howard always brought this up. If you study Dr. King, it's remarkable how he moved first to desegregation, and then he moved to understand part of that was the war. And then he moved from that to understand it was all wrapped up in poverty. And he moved in that direction. And all these things are tied up together. The Reverend Howard is absolutely correct. And if you hit one, you start to hit the others. And so my belief has always been that we can do a lot of things, we ought to do a lot of things. But at heart of it, we've got to give our children a chance to get to know each other. Our country is divided in so many ways right now. And
That's
every
right.
time we try to solve problems like this, and unless we get to know each other, understand each other, like each other, value each other, we're going to have a lot harder time solving those problems.
I agree. I agree fully. And let me say too, that privileged people of whatever color are rewarded based upon their economic station and their education and so on, but they don't feel as imprisoned as they are. Their very affluence prevents them from actually meeting people who are different than themselves, as Governor Kean has said. I would suggest, Governor, that it may have been a bit easier 50 years ago to meet people across economic and racial lines. But today, I'll tell you, for example, where Bethany is located, in the central ward of Newark. Go back 50, 60 years, a kid without a lot of financial resources and so on could step out of his front door and encounter Black professionals.
That's correct.
You can't do that anymore. I mean, Black professionals are living in Short Hills and Livingston and wherever. And so that kid, by virtue of his economic station, is not only, if I can say this respectfully, stuck in place. He doesn't get to meet a person, particularly a person who looks like him, who is in a different place to which he might aspire. And in the segregated South, I can say, and I'm not an apologist for segregation, don't get me wrong, but that was the great benefit of my own experience. I had no exposure educationally with whites, but I had teachers who had gone to, Columbia Teachers College or University of Pittsburgh or wherever in graduate school. And they had stories of life beyond the wall of Jim Crow that they would share with us. And so I think we have to think about how the structure of economic privilege has become tighter in the last 50 years, how the income disparities and wealth disparities have actually grown. Can you imagine that? After King's Poor People's Campaign and focusing on the issue of poverty, This is why Barber is a guy that I really like in terms of what he's trying to accomplish. The disparities have become greater today. Now, I don't have the stats, but I think, you could probably support that with a little research. And so if there is an advantage of people crossing racial lines and economic lines, the opportunity for that is more rare today than it might have been a generation or two ago.
I think we can address this. In the past, this democracy has been somewhat self-correcting in the area of wealth inequality. Abraham Lincoln, remember, made land in the West available to anybody who was willing to work it. And if they worked it, they could keep it. Teddy Roosevelt, the malefactors of great wealth, went after the worst of that crowd very publicly. Franklin Roosevelt, a lot of the programs of the New Deal. Lyndon Johnson, a lot of these people going after wealth inequality in one way or another. Now, it hasn't happened in a long time, but it has over the years been self-correcting. And I think we can hopefully have another such movement where we will address economic inequality, because every poll I've seen says now 80% or 90% of the American people recognize it's a problem. So I think people may be willing to address it. But to me, that's not enough. I mean, you can start addressing that as we have in the past, but you've got to address getting people together in this democracy. So they live together, work together, go to school together, their families know each other. Otherwise, I'm not sure we're going to get where you and I are both trying to go.
Governor Kean, you appointed Justice Gary Stein to the New Jersey Supreme Court. He, as you know, has since retired, and he, along with Larry Lussberg, an attorney, and one of our board members of Lake's body, are litigating a case to ultimately integrate New Jersey's classrooms, public classrooms. Can you say a word about that effort and how that would help to move New Jersey in a direction that we'd all like to see?
Yeah, Gary Stein's a great guy, and I'm proud to have appointed him to the Supreme Court, but he's now heading an effort with a number of other very good people from Rutgers and other places to look at New Jersey and point out that it has among the most segregated schools in the entire country, years after Brown versus Board of Education. And that's not only wrong, it's illegal, Constitution. And so he has filed a lawsuit with these other good people to say we've got to have a plan to bring this segregation to an end in a state like New Jersey. Now, they filed the case. I thought a lot of people were going to stand up and applaud. They haven't. In fact, a number of very good people, I respect, are opposing it because I think they figure it's going to be difficult or it's going to not be good politically for them or whatever. So I don't get, for instance, this administration is not supporting the case. It's putting roadblocks in the way of the case. So I think one of the things we can all do is get behind that case and tell our politicians, I know it's going to be difficult. Desegregation is a very difficult job, particularly because schools involve neighborhoods. But if we're going to get what we have to get in this country, it's got to happen. And we got to at least get started. And this lawsuit is a very good way to get started.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to ask the governor about Mount Laurel and how that has evolved, because that was some kind of effort to deal with economic desegregation of neighborhoods. And I know that whole thing, I think, has been sort of vitiated by trading off with municipalities and so on. And then the Abbott decision, which was meant as some good faith effort, I think, to try and address. I don't know, how do you feel about all of this? Because there have been efforts, right?
There are efforts, but they've been misguided. I think they've been misguided. Mount Laurel, I was never a fan of Mount Laurel. He was supported primarily by the Builders Association. They wanted to break zoning and build in the suburbs. The houses that were built, basically middle-class homes, that didn't attract the people from the cities. What you really had to do is attract people who lived in urban neighborhoods to come to the suburbs and desegregate them. Or you had to rehabilitate houses in the cities so that people in the cities had a decent place to live. Mount Laurel didn't really do either of those things. So I was never a great fan of that one, even though I recognize some people who were for it were very well motivated. The court decision, and that's been litigated now for 50 years, 40 years
Yes.
in the state, and it's never really done what it was supposed to do.
Mhm.
And I don't think that was, there were some fundamental, we haven't time to go into it, there were fundamental mistakes made in the legislature under school education law. When it linked to the income tax, they put some language in, which is not that helpful. And it just hadn't happened. But I think we've got to start anew. I think those were efforts, they weren't successful. We've got to start anew. I think, as I say, the case is a good place to start. There are other places to start. It's harder to start in the legislature. It's a very hard political issue. So I think the courts are the place to go.
But we also have to go back to the origins of things in order to find our way forward. And this requires, of course, a lot of study and talk and sharing. But I remember, Ryan, that Dr. Nell Painter, when she arrived in Newark, still on the faculty at Princeton, but she arrived in Newark, and we persuaded her to address the annual NAACP dinner. And being the distinguished historian that she is, she took the occasion to talk about how ring suburbs were incentivized by federal policy after the Second World War, and how there was racial discrimination built into those policies. And the governor knows very well what happened in Newark, you know, not just after 67. Everybody wants to blame things on 67, but 67 was almost like a result of some things that had transpired for many years before.
Yeah, absolutely. And the federal policy was behind it, a lot of it.
Yes.
I remember my father served in Congress for 20 years. One of the towns he represented was Montclair. Montclair had at the time a very substantial and actually quite wealthy African-American community. And he, all of a sudden, the Washington administration said, we're gonna have to put an armory. We're gonna put it in Montclair. And where did they pick? They picked the heart of the Afro-American community. And my father went to war on that one. And he fought I think it was the Eisenhower administration or Kennedy, one of them. He fought him for 2 years, I think, before we finally got him to locate the armory somewhere else. And there were 2 points I'd make. One is they located it there because they thought it was a Black community and therefore there'd be no opposition. It'd be an easy thing to do. The town wouldn't oppose it. And the second thing is, when my father did that, and he ran about 3 or 4 more times, every time he ran, that section, the African-American section in Montclair, voted very heavily for him, even though they were normally a Democratic vote at that point. So the African-American community understands those who do something for them and are willing to respond in votes. And that's what politicians got to learn, and Republicans in particular, that if you go and work with the African-American community, they'll help you, they'll support you, or a number of them will, no matter what your party is.
To that point, Governor Kean, I appreciate you framing it that way, because it makes me think of the point you made, Pastor Howard, about economic justice and about the numbers. So there's another number that says that by around 2053, this is pre-coronavirus, the median net wealth of Black families nationally will go to 0, right? Very often, I think Black voters turn out some of the highest numbers for a particular candidate or party. And very often that particular candidate or party doesn't have a specific response to that specific challenge. And so I mentioned that, you know, I think
I would like to say this, because I want my party to hear it. I got 60% of the Black vote running against a liberal, a fine guy, a friend of mine, a good candidate against me from Essex County. And I got 60% of the African-American vote because of that. I carried Camden, I carried Newark, I carried Jersey City, and all of that. And I thought my party in particular was going to step in Washington and say, how do you do that? Let's all get together. They couldn't have cared less.
Let's stick with this, because I think we're at the kernel of something that the audience knows and should embrace. One, pick your most affluent suburb in New Jersey in terms of property value, etc. Best schools, pick it. You know, Deal, Alpine, you know, Short Hills, Livingston, Cherry Hill. I don't know where you pick. Pick those places and go visit. And there you will find affluent African Americans living.
That's
Okay.
true.
Now, we got to understand what that is. And if we're going to press forward, we got to recognize that we're dealing with economic residential segregation. Economic residential segregation. And within affluent districts, you have segregation within otherwise integrated high schools. Take Montclair, for example. I don't know the true inner workings of Montclair or South Orange Maplewood. What's our great high school over there? What's it called?
In Maplewood, Columbia?
Columbia High School. These schools send people off to Ivy League colleges every year, okay?
That's true.
But you go inside these schools, and I live in such a district. If you go into advanced placement physics, you might find one Black kid in the class. Maybe there's a 30% Black population in the school. But if you go to the non-academic courses, there's where you will find the majority of them. And it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have the academic aptitude to pursue higher learning, but they are literally channeled. They're literally channeled. I'm married to a Princeton girl, Governor, and she went to Princeton High School. And she told me, the kid from the South, that in her high school, she was pressed by her faculty because she wanted to consider an academic course. She was discouraged. And it was only because of her parents' insistence that she went into the academic track. There were many families who didn't know this distinction. And this also happened to many Italian kids, okay? They were channeled to honorable labor. I'm not disparaging that, but nonetheless, they were discouraged from taking the academic courses that were for college aspirants. And so all of this is a part of the mix. And we have to, if we're going to press forward, we have to take all of the ugliness into account if we're to adopt solutions that really address the problem.
So, Pastor, you can't hear, but my wife is giving you nonstop amens from our school here.
Is she a Baptist?
I think she would call herself non-denominational, but for purposes of conversation, she's Southern Baptist right now. Straight
Yes.
Baptist. But so let me
look. Let me just say too, on education, I'm going to say this loud and clear. I am in favor of non-racial or racially integrated schools. I'm in favor of that. But we have to be careful not to equate the presence of Blacks and whites in the same class organically as superior. Because, look, I was in a high school with the most well-equipped teachers you can imagine, and they were dedicated. They're the teachers who would come to your house and speak to your grandmother if you weren't paying attention in school. But the Bunsen burners and the calibrated cylinders were in disrepair when we received them. If you can believe, a calibrated cylinder with a crack that would hardly hold the liquid in a chemistry class. All of our textbooks were used. They had the names of white children in them before we received them, meaning that they were now out of print. So there's nothing wrong with an all-Black school, except that when the white kids are there, that's when the money flows to the schools. You see, that's another issue there.
to that point, I have to invoke her again, but my wife would say that the challenge is not that she's never had a white kid in her school.
Yeah.
The challenge is that the resources reflect that. So that today, Avon Avenue School doesn't have a functional gym, nor does it have a kitchen. So that their food is brought to the school, which raises all manner of challenges. And she would say that as history goes, money always follows white children, which is why integration is important, to your point, Dr. Howard. So, but I want to lift up this point before we move to the next and last part of our discussion around your book, Black Not Dutch, which, as you know, is a book where you explore from a sort of faith-based perspective the issue of reparations and how do you repair harm. And so I want to ask you to weigh in on that, particularly with respect to the reality that we have, again, one of the most staggering racial wealth gaps in the land. It bears repeating that in New Jersey, the median net wealth for white families, $352,000, highest net wealth of any family in the country, but just $6,100 for Black families, $7,300 for Latinx families. And so I would love for you to talk about the sort of the premise of your book around reparations in the context of economic justice in a state like New Jersey.
Well, 40 acres and a mule was a lot simpler. You know, it's much more complex today. And that's why I support, I think it's HR 40. I'm not sure, I should have looked that up. But HR 40 calls for the creation of a commission on sort of in the character of 9/11. You know, distinguished, knowledgeable, uncorruptible people who know their stuff, who will come together and think this thing through. Because, look, because of the multi-generational poverty that we have, particularly in our post-industrial cities, and the culture, the social environment that we have built, I am actually not in favor of granting individuals compensation for whatever they do. But I do believe that certain kinds of regulated preferences for things like business loans and education funding, I don't know what they should all comprise, but things of that magnitude, structural, institutional investments. But I'm a firm believer in reparations. And I hope my friends out there will stop telling me that reparations is some kind of unusual idea, when in fact it's quite commonplace. And I think that we, if you look at Eddie's book, and I keep coming back to that, we need the resolve of white people to push this thing forward, not just reparations, but the whole real reconstruction that we need has to have committed white allies invested in this. I don't mean they take the place of Black advocacy, but we need, in the same way that we need courage in the US Senate today to take certain kinds of actions, right? Now, in my book, I talk about the Black Manifesto, which was a specific challenge to Christian churches and synagogues, not to the nation, but to religious institutions, to pay into a fund of reparations to address the role that they had played in the enslavement and otherwise oppression of Black people. And if you go back and read the Black Manifesto, which is in the index of the book, it actually talks about funding Black educational institutions of higher learning, banks, and other entities that could shore up the community in a structural way. And I'm pleased to see that the reparations discussion has reached the level of a congressional proposal, whether it will keep going. You see, the problem of America is that we're not very studious in terms of our history, and that cuts across all racial groups. And there are white people in the country who believe that they have no connection to slavery. They should learn otherwise. And this is not to be feeling guilty or persecuted. It's about facing the truth about our country, the journey that we have traversed during our period of existence, and how we can make the right positive, restorative turn and become a great nation, become a true democratic experiment. I'm saying this at a time when we actually have leaders of the country trying to suppress the votes of citizens. We will never be great and stable, I might add, as long as we are prohibiting participation and not providing the opportunity for people to be economically viable. I saw I don't want to be so political, but I see this discussion about how people will take $600 a week as a disincentive to return to work. And I said, you mean to tell me if I got $600, it'll make me not want to go to work? What can you do in New Jersey with $600 a week? My God.
So Governor Kean, I want to ask you to respond to Pastor Howard's point about the reparations and repairing harm. I just want to say quickly to those watching with us that we created a document called 10 Things You Can Do to Advance Racial Justice After You Say Black Lives Matter. You can find that on our website, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Drop it in the chat. But if you look at number 10, you'll find, to Pastor Howard's point, legislation that was introduced here in New Jersey that would urge New Jersey to, one, take responsibility for its role in American slavery, and then two, to make policy and other recommendations in response to it. It is a bill that was introduced last year and again at the beginning of this year. It turns out no state in the country has ever passed a bill like this. And with your support, to your point, Pastor Howard, with broader support, it will pass, and New Jersey will be the first state to ever do it. And it's an important piece of, I think, this reckoning that we're realizing here in America about how we have to finally confront the cracks in our foundation caused by structural racism. So Governor Kean, wanted you to say a word before we move on to the sort of the way forward and then move the Q&A part of this conversation.
Yeah, just, I was very involved in the last reparations bill in the Congress, the Japanese reparations bill, and I helped get it through and helped get the president to sign it. So I'm very familiar with reparations. I thought of this reparations effort in the same light. In other words, you gave dollars to people to make up for past sins. And I'm not for that because I think it's been too hard to define the people. And I don't think whatever you put in somebody's pocket is going to be more than a temporary help. The way Bill Howard defines it, I can support it because what you're talking about is something that is really going to raise the society, make us a more caring nation, help people have the ability to succeed the way they should, and make some structural reforms perhaps at the same time. I mean, this, I don't know if I call it reparations, but you define it that way and I'm all for it. And I'd be glad to help you get whatever we can do to get it through.
And in connection with that, Governor, I would appeal, if I had the megaphone sufficient to do it, that our countrymen, men and women, stop denying that we were a slave nation. It is a fact. And nobody's trying to spank you because of that. We're trying to say, let's, as the great philosopher, Minnie Howard, my father's mother, used to say, son, if you want to get out of a mess, you need to know how you got into it. You see, America is better than slavery if we could only acknowledge that that is a legitimate part of our past. I think we need to put all of our Confederate generals in the history books and take them off of statures, because by putting them on statures, we are celebrating them, but by putting them in the history books, and you're a historian, okay?
I am by training. Yep.
You are acknowledging them. And there's nothing, I'm completely against pretending that Robert E. Lee never existed. But I'm equally opposed to putting him high on a stature as if he was a great man in creating what we aspire to be. He's exactly the opposite of that.
Amen, Pastor.
I think so. And just slavery. A lot of nations had slavery. History
Yes.
of the world is full of slaves. Native American tribes had slaves. But our great difference is our slavery was racist and racial. We enslaved people because they were African American, because they were Black. Other civilizations never did that. And that's something unique in our history and something we've got to reckon with and something we've got to solve, because you're right. It's in our past.
But it's also, as a theologian, I have to tell you, we developed the theory of Black inferiority after the Africans were enslaved, because the Christians knew that unless they defined them as subhuman, theologically, they couldn't justify it. See,
Correct.
Dealing with that, and also dealing with courageous white people who have lost their lives in the struggle, going back to the beginning, addressing Black people who were involved in not only propagating, but originating the slave trade. It's called truth-telling. The first chapter in Eddie Glaude's book is called The Lie.
And that, Reverend Howard, is the best transition to the final question I'll pose. We talk about truth-telling. We began the conversation by invoking Congressman John Lewis, who was the ultimate truth-teller. Folks know that he marched over his final bridge last month. And one of his last public appearances was at the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. He was joining the Black Lives Matter protest. One of his last public appearances, he went to the hospital the following day. And as many have seen, he wrote this essay shortly before he died. Then he asked that it be published on the day of his funeral. I know that you both knew Congressman Lewis. He talked about how he was inspired and filled with hope by what he described as the next chapter of the American story, with millions of people taken to the streets in protest to redeem the soul of America. I just want to ask you a question after I read to you, Governor Kean, a bit about what he said in that piece, where he said, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting into what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in democracy are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you can have in a democratic society. You must use it because it's not guaranteed, and you can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history, because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build movements stretch across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. And I ask you, Governor Kean, as we close this conversation and move to the Q&A portion, what do you think is the way forward? And how do we begin to repair some of the harm caused so that we can help to redeem the soul of America? And then after you weigh in, Governor Kean, we'll turn to good trouble, Reverend Howard, for a quick final word.
Well, first of all, there are very few greater people I've ever met in my life than Congressman Lewis, for a number of reasons. And that statement is as eloquent as you could possibly be. I couldn't add a thing to it, except he's absolutely right. You got to start a number of, I don't think you start any one place. Education I like so much because it starts when they're young. It starts kids getting to know each other. As Reverend says, economic, you've got to adjust the economic part of it. You cannot have the kind of wealth inequality we have, not only existing, but building in this country that we have today. We've got to start talking to each other much more often, and not just across the racial divide. I mean, now we've got all sorts of divisions in this country, and we don't talk to each other. We've got to find us, maybe I think, a couple of sources of news that we all can listen to and respect. So I don't get my facts over here and you get your facts over there and we can't meet. And I could go on. I mean, there's so many things I think we have to do to get this started, but it starts with dialogue. It starts to getting to know each other, respect each other, and eventually, hopefully, love each other.
Amen, Governor Kean. Pastor Howard, do you have a quick final word before we go to the Q&A?
I say so too.
Beautiful. That was awesome. Thanks for the conversation. Gentlemen, I'll now move to the Q&A. The first question is from Ralph Izzo, the PSEG. He says, Ryan, please say hello to my two favorite people on the planet. That's an upgrade. I guess that's you two. Two favorite people on the planet. Do you see a role for business leaders tackling these issues? We are increasingly focused on 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit. Or are these issues better left to grassroots movements or political leaders? That's a question for you, Governor Kean.
No, they're not best left. Never leave the issues to other groups or other people. You got to do it yourselves. And the business community can be so valuable. What PSEG is already doing is very valuable. We heard at the beginning of the show. Business leaders are respected in this country, no matter, they may not think they are, but they are. And when they take leadership on issues like this, when they step forward when other people aren't willing to step forward, other people will follow. Doesn't mean everybody else doesn't have to come along and do their own bit. Business leaders are enormously valuable. People like Ralph Izzo are exactly what we need in this country.
Pastor Howard, this is a question from you from Imogen Gustavson, who's 7 years old, who asks, how come so many people were protesting the Black Lives Matter in our town, which is West Orange, a few weeks ago, but they aren't anymore?
That's a difficult one. It doesn't mean that because people are no longer protesting visibly, that they are no longer concerned. So don't associate their absence from the streets or from overt protest with an absence of concern. And there's an old expression I would leave with this young person. If it is to be, it depends on me. And I say, if you're concerned that people have left the demonstrations, you can always demonstrate yourself. And I guarantee you, when adults see you out protesting, they'll be embarrassed and join you.
Governor Kean, this one is from you. This is from Marshall Jones. Marshall says, Governor Kean, I'm a registered Democrat. You were the only Republican that I've ever voted for because I felt like you had the interests of Black Americans in your heart. Can you please comment on the current state of your party? It's very different from when you governed our state. And thank you, Reverend Howard, for your public service.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because I think there's still, first of all, I think voters should be selective. I think to vote a straight party line of either party, generally when faced with a ballot with 25 candidates on it, is probably wrong. Find out who the Republicans you really think men agree with, or ones that are going to lead the party in a different direction, are, and support them. Because we need two responsible parties in this country. I disagree in a number of areas where my party is at the moment on a number of issues. But I'm going to do my best to try and change that. I'm going to try and find people, young people in my party, who are willing to fight, join me in that change. We've done quite well in this country with two responsible political parties. And I think we got to get back to that point. My feeling is in the future is going to be a huge fight over the heart and soul of the Republican Party. It's either going to become a populist party, which I think would be disastrous for the country in many ways, or it's going to go back to being responsible in a number of ways I think both you and I would like it to be. And I think we're going to need people to join us
Mhm.
to try and make sure the Republican Party is a responsible party in the future, as it's been from time to time in the past.
This question is both for you, Pastor Howard, and you, Governor King. It comes from Rick Thigpen, who we know also works with Ralph at PSEG. He says, as two people both connected to Princeton, what are your thoughts about Princeton's decision to remove Woodrow Wilson's name from the School of Public Affairs? And is that a meaningful gesture?
Governor, that's your alma mater. Why don't you go?
Okay. It was the right decision, should have made a long time ago. Because I'm not saying Woodrow Wilson should be removed from any number of things around the country, but he should be removed from an academic institution which has certain ideals and is holding up those ideals to young people. I give Princeton, by the way, no credit for what it did, because previously people had asked them to take the name off that thing, and Princeton put up some sort of group together, and they studied it and came back and said, no, we won't. We'll just tell people what Woodrow Wilson did some bad things, well, some good things. So they decided not to do it. Then came this pressure. They didn't form another committee. They just did it because of the pressure. So look, I think it's the right thing to do. But as much as I love Princeton, I give them no credit for that decision. They should have done it a long time ago.
Do you want me to say something?
Absolutely.
Always.
Listen, I think it's fine. I'm not condemning or applauding Princeton. I essentially agree with the governor, but I would also say that Princeton did the very American thing. It did something to quell the noise for a while. But you see, Princeton has go to its core curriculum and you will find nothing there that is a part of the core. Now, it has a distinguished Department of African American Studies, but you understand, as I said earlier in the conversation, the institutions of higher learning are the gatekeepers of the notion of white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, racism. They're all reflected in the great literature of the West. And until Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford, and you go down the line, until they began to teach the great civilizations of Africa, the languages of Africa, the evidences of human achievement that is in Africa, and not Africa as a war-torn, poverty, S-hole place. You see? Until that happens, and by the way, if you are privileged to have certain opportunities in America, if you have, a certain amount of wealth, you may be under the illusion that the absence of this kind of knowledge in your university is no big thing to you. But everybody is disadvantaged by the ignorance that is perpetrated in this regard. We have to broaden our knowledge of human civilization and human aspiration and achievement so that we cannot be suspicious of our neighbor. What makes a working class ethnic white policeman feel licensed to just shoot a black person and ask questions later? This is deeply ingrained in the society. And you may not find that this officer has any personal record of affiliating with, some reprehensible racist group, but it is somehow in his psyche. And incidentally, in many instances, you will find police officers of color who are part and parcel to this kind of conduct. So you have to ask yourself, what is the root of that? That's how deep this thing is. Look, when I was a kid growing up in Americus, Georgia, I went to visit an aunt in Atlanta, and I was sitting on her front porch, and I saw an African-American police officer walk down the street. And I jumped up and ran in the house and I said to her, I just saw a colored policeman. I just saw a colored policeman. This was unheard of in my little town. And she very casually, she was working in the kitchen, and she very casually said, well, baby, if you do something wrong and the police are coming to get you, you better hope the white policeman gets to you first. What was she saying? That black police officers in the 1950s in Atlanta had a reputation for being even more brutal than their white counterparts. Why does the black policeman in that day think he has to outdo the white guy to prove himself as a police officer? This is why I say the conversation we're having now has some really deep roots. Black people internalizing the lie of white supremacy and producing conduct that reflects that.
Governor Kean, if we've got time for a few more questions, this one is for you from Anita Thomas. Anita asks, what has driven the extreme racial segregation in New Jersey, and who's responsible for correcting it?
Well, the leadership at any time is responsible for correcting it. We elect people to make decisions, and decisions should be moving in that direction. This is historic. It follows segregation in schools, follows racial housing patterns. Racism has been, fortunately, around, as we've been talking about tonight, for a long, long time. We have to support any number of ways to get around it and to beat it down and to correct it. And who's responsible? Every single member who we voted for is responsible, and the people we'll vote for next time will be responsible. But I mean, we got to work with our elected officials, but also put pressure on elected officials so they know there are voters out there who really want change in this area and demand it.
Yeah, thanks, Governor King. Pastor Howard, this one is for you, from Marcia Graydon, who asks whether you can suggest a way for Black people living in places like Livingston and Short Hills for them to connect with Black youth in the Central Ward of Newark, to your earlier point.
Well, I think that resident, unless they are members of a congregation in a place like Newark, or unless they are part of the girls and boys clubs or big brothers, big sisters, unless they undertake, and I'm not trying to name all the groups, these are just examples. Unless they connect with some groups like this, they are structurally channeled away from Newark. Let me give you an example. A trustee, white man from back in the day when I was at New York Seminary, lived in one of the towns there in Union County. I'm forgetting the name of it. I don't know why I'm forgetting it, but in Union County, very affluent place. And when I went to Bethany, he stayed in touch with me, because he was a strong trustee and we had a great relationship. And we had a program at Bethany called Youth Turn that mentored young men coming out of prison, young Black men, some Latino, but boys, all boys coming out of Jamesburg and Bordentown. And so we had this guy who wanted to do something, this white guy. And he said, Bill, why don't you let me host a meal at my house? And I'll invite some of my friends over and we'll tell them about what you guys are doing down in Newark. So we went to his home in Summit. That's the place I'm trying to think of, Summit. And he invited 3 couples to his home to join him and his wife. And one of those couples was a African-American couple. Both of them were high-level professionals in top-level companies, Goldman Sachs and McKinsey or something like that. Excellent, decent people. But there they were in Summit, but they had no connection to Newark whatsoever. And it's no fault of their own because they had good jobs and they bought a nice home in a nice suburban community. But unless they connect with institutions on the ground in a place like Newark, even coming and supporting the Institute, you see, they could be brought into some contact. And I recommend that to them.
Great points. So this will be our last question. I pose it to you both, Governor Kean and Pastor Howard. This comes both from Rick Robinson from the Newark NAACP and Don Stahl, who ask, what can we as residents of New Jersey actually do in this anxious, unprecedented time? So Pastor Howard, why don't you kick us off? And Governor Kean, you can give us the final word.
Well, I'm a life member of the Newark branch, and so it's my honor to respond to the NAACP question. I can say that we have to play to our strengths, be a good citizen, and think of what suits us best in terms of how we become engaged. That would be my first thought. And everybody can do something. For example, how outraged are you about what is happening in the Postal Service? How outraged are you that the Food and Drug Administration may be being compromised? As a citizen, this ought to concern you. And I think also we have to think broadly. For example, on my lawn today, when I say think broadly, be careful of quick and easy categories. Pigeonholing people. I have a Black Lives Matter sign on my lawn that is the gift of a white woman that I never knew until she gave me the sign. You got to be careful about how you pigeonhole people and think in terms of people who are aligning themselves with where you also want to go. I think this is the point that Governor Kean is making about how we choose candidates. Remember now, I'm from the Jim Crow South. Governor, we didn't have a Republican Party in America's Georgia. We had Richard B. Russell and Herman Talmadge, right?
Oh boy.
These were the Dixiecrats supreme.
Yeah.
Now, so you really have to think about where it is you want to go in economic equity, in racial justice, in social stability, in education, all these subjects we've been talking about this evening. You got to think critically, and it was said before, think about where we get our information from, or from which we get our information. Never put a preposition at the end of the sentence, your wife would tell us. So I would say, like, where do you get your so-called news from? Or is it entertainment? Is it polarizing entertainment? Do you know what National Public Radio is? Do you know what public television is? Do you read more than one newspaper? See, back in the day, they said, I read in the paper today. You can't get away with that anymore.
That's right.
So that's my first reaction.
Thanks, Pastor Howard. And Governor Kean, you've got the final word. The question again was from Rick Robinson, Newark NAACP, and Don Stahl, who asked, what can we, residents of New Jersey, actually do in this anxious, unprecedented time?
One of the things you can do is support the NAACP. You were kind enough to make me a Man of the Year at one point. I was
Here.
grateful for that. But look, we've said it before, Reverend Howard has said it. The best levers we have in this society and this democracy is the vote.
That's right.
But it's not just the vote. It's the intelligent vote. It's knowing who you're voting for and why. It's knowing what people stand for. It's knowing that all the good candidates aren't necessarily found in one party. They're in both parties, but you got to search for them. And you got to pick the right leaders, because we said before, if there's going to be change, it's going to be done by the leaders we elect. That's what a democracy is all about. So we've got to look at the ballot, all these candidates, and do the homework. Find out who's running, who you might don't know anything about. But once you look at that man or woman, black or white or whatever they are, you find out, they're making some good points. They're going to change their party. They're independent. They're not going to vote just with the party, not just with a boss. That people are going to make their own decisions, and the kind of person you'd like to have represent you. You do that homework, find the right people, cast vote intelligently, and things will change sooner or later. You'll be electing better and better people.
But here's the truth of our reality. We know that there are police officers, for example, who go to work every day, try to do the right thing, etc. But when one of their peers commit an egregious act against, let's say, a black person, they, like all their colleagues, close ranks. Yet they want us to say that they're not all bad. You can't have it both ways. And this is what I would say. If you look at what is going on now, I will accept, I'm talking national legislative politics now, I would accept that there are some Republicans who really want to do what is best for the country. But when the people who appear not to want that commit certain acts, they close ranks. And yet they want us to make a distinction. I think the governor, help me out on this, I think you would agree. The only person who dared to stand in the impeachment trial, and I'm not trying to get the governor to commit on this, I'm just saying Bill Howard, the only Republican to speak the truth with his vote was Mitt Romney. Now, what are we to think about that? See, I agree. It makes me nervous that we don't have a viable, progressive alternative to the Democratic Party. Makes me nervous, okay? Because I know how the Democrats can behave when they don't have real opposition. But where are we to pick among the Republicans when they don't distinguish themselves from the madness that we see?
I think impeachment was a blunt instrument and probably not the way to proceed, but we could debate that for a long time. But I'm saying basically, and I'm not talking just about the national party. I'm talking about the state candidates, the local candidates, the whole bunch. You will find all the way down the ballot, I suspect, some people you can pay out to vote for in the other party. And there'll be people who will honor you. And maybe they won't do it this year, maybe they'll do it next year, but get them into office. And they're the kind of people we can count on to serve this democracy, serve them honestly, and in the best interest, I think, of the average voter.
Yeah. And I think that is the perfect way to end on your point, Governor Kean, about service to our democracy that requires us right now to make sure that we register to vote, that we vote for every position on the ballot, from the local elections to the federal elections, that we fill out our census form. It's critical. It's of critical importance that we are counted in the census, that we take John Lewis's admonition, that we get into good trouble so that we can together redeem the soul of this community. I urge you to take a look at the Institute's 10 things you can do to advance racial justice advocacy after you say Black Lives Matter. There are 10 things ranging from work around transforming policing, economic justice, and repairing the harm of structural racism. I want to thank Governor Kean, Pastor Howard, John Schreiber and his team at NJPAC, and all of you for joining us. Thank you for your commitment to good trouble, and we'll see you next time. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
And to you.